What I'm going to try to do is take the big picture that my colleague presented to you and pull it together to something that I think we talked about and began the day with, which is the intersection of politics and policy and how that plays out, and particularly this year with an election year, and from the military and defense perspective. So all of you must be wondering, okay, so what happens to Chinese policy as we move from the Obama administration to either a Trump administration or a Clinton administration? And how do politics and policy actually get implemented as we prepare for that kind of transition and then as we execute it? So the first thing I'd like to talk about is just a little bit of what's going on right now with transition teams. And those transition teams are probably making the following assessments. Number one, that our current policies are not diminishing the tension, particularly in the region, regarding China's aggressive behavior. Number two, that basically our relationships with China are not great. There are lights, particularly on trade and economy, but the overall perception is that China is more aggressive than it used to be, and that aggression is harming U.S. and its allies' interests. And number three, that particularly in the defense and security realm, that a lot of our traditional policies and activities may be based on assumptions that are no more applicable. And my colleague touched upon some of the recent changes, particularly in security and military reformation and modernization, that have a lot of impact on the way our military is looking at China today. So the second thing that's going to come into their thinking is that, well, why is it at least that part of the population is responding to a demonization, so to speak, of China? We talked about it today in terms of one particular candidate, in terms of demographics, perhaps racism, location, impact on trade. But what we didn't talk about is perceptions and the idea that if you have a perceived widening gap in values, if you have a perceived widening gap in ties, people respond accordingly. Whether that gap is demonstrable through analysis and findings and mathematical calculations or not. And certainly, I think there's the concept in a certain sector of the population that China has gotten more aggressive. The second, I think, that is fair to say is that the One Belt, One Road may be good for China, but it's certainly not agnostic as compared to everyone else. And to the extent that it helps China increase its hegemonic activities or increase its coercion or to push allies in the region or regional players in a certain direction, it may be bad. And then thirdly, human rights. The number of Americans who are still thinking about Tiananmen Square and who are still thinking about the pictures that we all saw in the magazines, that resonates and is held very, very much in the forefront of U.S. perception, certainly in certain voters, of what is China. And then finally, there's everything that's happening in the military sphere in the South China Sea. A lot of publicity, a lot of talk, and a lot of coverage of this island building, which from an environmental standpoint, people are thinking, oh my goodness, what are the impact on our reefs? And from a military and security perspective, it's, oh my goodness, what is happening to U.S. interests and those of our allies, particularly, as my colleague pointed out, in confrontation with an international legal ruling to which all of the community, whether you're a signatory or not, needs to be held. So this perception, these voters who are going one way or the other or happy to be aligning with one character or one candidate or the other, there's an underlying perception gap with China not being as interested as the U.S. is, and perhaps even as interested as China used to be in regional stability. Now the question is, as I believe Dr. Sun said this morning, what is regional stability and how do you define it? And I think one of the things that we're finding is that there are very different approaches by the governments as to what that is. So back to the practical matter. So as you have teams preparing the candidates, they're sorting through all of those issues and all of those assumptions, and they're trying to figure out what then is China's goal in the region. And I think it would be fair to say that from a security and military perspective, our military has been fairly open about what that is. And the first, I think that it's fairly accepted that definitely China is more interested in promoting itself as a pivotal player, as the player economically and politically in the region, and that it will use military tools to do so. Secondly, that from a military security perception, China is looking for regional preemption. And thirdly, that in conjunction and in parallel to this, not only increasing its power and the perception of its power in the region, but China is very interested in increasing the perception and its role internationally. And the way that this plays out then for the PLA is really two primary goals. First goal being to develop the capacity to deter, and defeat any regional ally, period. And that means in the physical world and in the cyber, nuclear, and other worlds. Secondly, to prohibit and deter any third party from intervening in the region as a result of a crisis or armed conflict. Militarily, from a security perspective, those are the two common foundational assumptions regarding what the Chinese military is seeking as you look at their very activities and policy. So then the military experts start developing their policies and their criteria for sitting down the candidates and saying, in the short term, as you rack and stack your policies, China is front and center, not only from a human rights standpoint, from a trade standpoint, et cetera, but from our criteria, from our rice bowl, as many people would say, an immediate articulated policy that's militarily and security sound, vis-a-vis China, and one that the Chinese understand is a priority. What are the goals? From a national security standpoint, the goals are protection of U.S. national rights, freedom of navigation being one of those, protection of U.S. territory, and U.S. territory comes in, of course, with our deployments, as well as North Korea's threat to our territory by its nuclear weapon, in which China plays a huge part. Number two, regional stability, and that means the safety, not only militarily, but economically and politically, of the U.S. allies. Number four, risk reduction, risk mitigation, making sure that these two, that this tension and these two powers mitigate risk and not have it flare up unnecessarily, that it's controlled. And then finally, better mill-to-mill relations, in part as a tool to mitigate that risk. So as the president, the national security advisor listen to this, the next thing that the military will do after hearing from the national security advisor and from the State Department is say, what are the major muscle movements? What are the major focuses of interest that a president has to focus on during his first term in office? The underlying assumption being that you will be tested early, and you will be tested early most likely by adversaries such as North Korea and very possibly by China. Number one, Chinese sovereignty claims. I think my colleague talked a lot about the issue of the rising perception of Chinese aggression when it comes to the East and the South China Seas. Certainly the island building is one of them. The perception, of course, that the Spratly Islands, over 3,000 acres, clearly of civilian and military nature, that there is a lack of understanding as to what exactly are the military installations and the apparatus being built. Still a lot of speculation as to whether these are going to accommodate jets, but some very good analysis that these will not only be used to protect China's periphery, but will be used as part of a developing Chinese desire to be expeditionary within the region and beyond the region, and that this will serve as basically a lily pad in order to do so. Secondly, that they will serve as support mechanisms for this growing militia that is becoming increasingly problematic, not only from a freedom of navigation standpoint, but from a military standpoint. And these are the so-called Coast Guards, the so-called militia who are fishermen or not in uniform, that are coming from fishing fleets, from local entities, but who are clearly being trained, equipped, and act in coordination with either Chinese Navy or other official Chinese government interests. The perception here is key. In the military and security world, the concept is developing that China learned from Russia's movements in the Ukraine and Crimea as to the value of plausible deniability on surrogates, and that this is an early indication of a problem that right now is confined to the maritime realm, but that could become increasingly difficult should China choose to adopt it in other places, or even go as far as to do the near far, the idea of Chinese diaspora or Chinese citizens in regional countries having some claims to protection of China. Second, support to North Korea. You're starting to hear a bit of a drumbeat of a real push in Washington in particular to deal with the still surprising pace and level in which North Korea is advancing both its nuclear program and its missile programs, not only from a technological standpoint, but in defiance of alleged Chinese requests that they cease and desist, or at least tone it down a little bit. I think by and large, I was recently on a Council of Foreign Relations panel that had bipartisan experts in the room. I don't think there was anyone in the room, and this would be part of the pool that both the candidates will be pulling from for expertise, believe that China had even begun to pressure North Korea as to its missiles and nuclear program. And there's really no mystery as to why. It's because China's made the decision that it's not in its national interest to terminate or change that relationship. And that the US, by its failed policy over the last decades to get out of this cycle of provocations by North Korea, talks, some accommodations, a vacant period until the next provocation, with no significant change in either the programs themselves or the North Korean desire to have the programs. Very possibly, this is one area where the disconnect of understanding Chinese concerns and American concerns will be most pronounced and most deadly. For example, the concept that many Chinese are hardwired to view the peninsula as a very historic means through which invaders have always come. And the idea that their strategic depth depends on a satellite state, if you will, on the peninsula, and a nuclear armed one being basically more in China's interests than dealing with the US complaints about it, which is where we stand today, absent a Chinese decision to change their North Korea policy. Third, the military reforms and technical advances by the Chinese. I think my colleague actually talked about a number of them. The reform, not only from a standpoint of honing down its military, but focusing its military on more professionalism, more expeditionary, and more asymmetric capabilities. Here, the common accepted analysis is that the Chinese learned a lot from the two U.S. activities in the Middle East, particularly as to logistics and the speed and the interaction between special forces, conventional forces, and air support. That condensed with a more joint approach and an enhanced command and control means that we're dealing with a different PLA than we've dealt with before. And the concept that that PLA is being used differently by the leadership and that aggression is to the detriment of US interests. From a technological standpoint, then you take that and you add cruise missiles, short, medium, and intermediate range ballistic missiles, high performance aircraft, an integrated defense network from the standpoint of technology, information operations, and a big emphasis on amphibious and airborne assault, and you have what many perceive as a deliberate attempt to to build a military that is more threat-oriented than it's been in the past and more broadly based with excellence. In fact, many of my colleagues here, I'm sure, know better than I that there is a big effort to get individuals out of college with college educations now to join the PLA. And it's not so much the farmer who has moved into the city, who can't find a job and decides to spend his career in the Army. I think I talked about asymmetric warfare for a moment, but there's also a concept that better or more than before, the traditional military weapons are being used in conjunction with economic, cyber, nuclear, and space capabilities, that these are all in concert. I think it's common knowledge that most of the PLA units, if not all of them, have a cyber command, that cyber espionage and cyber hacking is clearly one of the tools, not only of the Chinese toolkit economically and financially, but is now fully integrated militarily. And then again, my suggestion of its use of proxies and space. I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to quickly sum up. So what basically will happen for both of these candidates is the military will talk about these 4 areas and basically make recommendations about how the next policy by that administration, by that president, begin to formulate activities which they will launch under a broader umbrella of the economic, political, human rights, and other activities. But clearly, there's a disconnect that you can see in Washington that the new president is going to have to deal with, and that's the increasing vocalization by military officers that Chinese aggression, particularly in the East and South China Seas, has not been dealt with, and it poses an immediate danger to U.S. assets, number one. Number two, that the time has run out, or is very close to running out, to force the Chinese or to coerce the Chinese to deal effectively with North Korea, and the perception that if they won't, what are we willing to do? For the first time in a long time, there are some advocates that are suggesting interdiction or preemption of North Korea testing or launches of missiles that have a payload over the size of the payload of a Scud missile, something very different, something that's never happened in the 4 decades since we left North Korea, and those will be at the forefront of decision making. Thank you very much for your attention.